In January 2023, something happened in West Africa that shocked the international community. A country that had maintained military ties with a powerful European nation for decades suddenly said something that few expected. They said, "Leave." The country was Burkina Faso. The nation they were speaking to was France. For years, French soldiers had been stationed in Burkina Faso as part of a counter-terrorism mission across the Sahel region of Africa. Officially, these troops were there to help fight extremist groups. But suddenly, the government of Burkina Faso announced that the agreement allowing French forces to stay in the country had been cancelled. French troops had 1 month to leave. Within weeks, military convoys packed their equipment. Aircraft carried soldiers away. A chapter that had lasted decades was coming to an end. Across Burkina Faso, crowds gathered in the streets. Some people celebrated. They waved national flags. Others carried posters showing a famous revolutionary leader, a man whose ideas still echo through the country. His name was Thomas Sankara. For many young Africans, Sankara represents a dream of true independence, a dream that some believe was interrupted decades ago. And now, many people felt that the country was finally trying to finish what Sankara had started. But to understand why Burkina Faso expelled France, we must go much deeper into history. This decision was not only about modern politics, it was about a relationship that began more than a century earlier. A relationship born during the Age of Empire. In the late 19th century, European nations became obsessed with a new prize, Africa. At that time, most of the continent was not controlled by European governments. African kingdoms, empires, and societies had existed for centuries. But European powers were growing rapidly stronger. Their factories needed raw materials. Their economies demanded new markets. Their governments wanted prestige and power, and Africa offered all of these things. Between 1884 and 1885, European leaders gathered in Germany for an important meeting. This meeting became known as the Berlin Conference. During this conference, European powers divided Africa among themselves. They drew borders on maps, borders that often ignored the cultures, languages, and histories of African people. The goal was simple: control land, control resources, control trade routes. France became one of the largest colonial powers in Africa. By the early 1900s, France controlled huge territories across West Africa. These territories were organized into a colonial system called French West Africa. It included several modern nations such as Senegal, Mali, Niger, and a territory known at the time as Upper Volta. Upper Volta would later become Burkina Faso. Under French colonial rule, life changed dramatically for local populations. The French administration controlled the government. They controlled taxation. They controlled trade. Many Africans were forced to work on colonial projects. Some built railways. Others worked in mines. Farmers were required to grow crops that benefited France. Cotton became especially important. Large amounts were exported to European textile factories. For the colonial government, Upper Volta served mainly as a source of labor and resources. But for local communities, colonial rule brought hardship. Traditional systems of leadership were weakened. Local economies were disrupted. Families were sometimes separated as men were forced into labor far from home. Yet despite these challenges, resistance never completely disappeared. African communities maintained their cultures, their languages, their traditions, and slowly a new idea began to grow. An idea that would reshape the continent. The idea of independence. The world changed dramatically after the Second World War. European empires were no longer as strong as they once had been. Many countries were exhausted after years of war. At the same time, people living in colonies began demanding freedom. Across Asia and Africa, independence movements began to grow. In 1947, India gained independence from Britain. This event inspired many leaders around the world. If independence was possible in one place, it could happen elsewhere. African students studying in Europe began organizing political movements. Workers formed unions. Intellectuals wrote powerful essays about freedom and dignity. The idea of colonial rule was being challenged everywhere. France faced growing pressure across its African territories. Eventually, reforms began. African leaders were allowed to participate in political institutions. But many activists believed these reforms were not enough. They wanted full independence. And by the late 1950s, the demand for independence had become unstoppable. In 1960, a historic wave of freedom swept across Africa. 17 African nations gained independence that year alone. One of them was Upper Volta. The country officially became an independent nation, but independence did not mean the end of French influence. Far from it, France maintained strong economic and military relationships with many of its former colonies. French companies remained deeply involved in African economies. French advisors continued working inside government institutions, and many African currencies remained linked to the French financial system. This system became known as on paper, African nations were sovereign, but in reality, many were still connected to France in powerful ways. This relationship would shape politics in Burkina Faso for decades. In the early 1980s, a young army officer began attracting attention in Upper Volta. He was charismatic, he spoke with passion, and he believed Africa deserved something better. His name was Thomas Sankara. Sankara was born in 1949. From a young age, he showed strong leadership qualities. He joined the military and quickly rose through the ranks. But Sankara was not only a soldier. He was also a thinker. He read widely about politics and history. He admired revolutionary leaders around the world. He was influenced by figures like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Sankara believed that true independence meant more than simply changing a flag. He believed African countries needed economic independence as well. He criticized the global financial system. He warned that foreign debt could trap poor countries in permanent dependency. His speeches became famous for their honesty and passion. Many young people in Upper Volta admired him. They saw him as a symbol of courage. In 1983, political tensions inside the country reached a breaking point. With support from allies in the military, Sankara took power. He was only 33 years old. And almost immediately, he began making bold changes. One of his first decisions was symbolic but powerful. He renamed the country. Upper Volta became Burkina Faso. The new name meant something important. Land of upright people. It represented dignity, integrity, and a new beginning. Once empowered, Thomas Sankara began implementing radical reforms. His vision was simple. Burkina Faso should rely on itself, not on foreign powers. He believed the country must build its own economy, produce its own food, and develop its own industries. One of his major priorities was agriculture. Sankara encouraged farmers to increase local food production. Within a few years, the country significantly increased grain output. Burkina Faso even became nearly self-sufficient in food. Another major focus was women's rights. Sankara believed that no society could progress while half its population remained oppressed. He appointed women to high government positions. He outlawed forced marriages. He promoted education for girls. He also launched ambitious public health campaigns. Millions of children were vaccinated against deadly diseases. Infrastructure projects were started across the country. Villages built schools. Communities constructed wells. But Sankara also made powerful enemies. He criticized corruption among African elites. He reduced the salaries of government officials. He forced ministers to drive modest cars instead of luxury vehicles. He even sold the government's fleet of expensive Mercedes cars. For many ordinary citizens, these actions made him a hero. But for powerful interests both inside and outside the country, Sankara's policies were deeply uncomfortable. When Thomas Sankara became president of Burkina Faso in 1983, the world did not pay much attention at first. Burkina Faso was a small and poor country in West Africa. Many people outside Africa had never even heard its name. But within a few years, Sankara would become one of the most talked about leaders in the developing world. He did something unusual. He tried to build a completely new model of leadership, a model based on honesty, simplicity, and Sankara believed leaders should live like the people they govern. He refused luxury. Instead of traveling in expensive government planes, he often used simple transportation. Instead of living in luxury, he kept his lifestyle modest. This shocked many observers. In many countries, political leaders enjoyed great wealth, but Sankara believed power should be used to serve the people, not to enrich the elite. He reduced the salaries of government officials. He sold the fleet of luxury cars owned by the government. Ministers were ordered to use simple vehicles instead. For many ordinary citizens, this created trust. They believed their president truly cared about them. But Sankara's revolution was not only about symbolism, he also launched real economic and social reforms. One of his biggest goals was food independence. At the time, many African countries depended heavily on imported food. This made them vulnerable. If global prices increased, millions of people could suffer. Sankara believed Burkina Faso should produce its own food. He encouraged farmers to grow more crops. He supported irrigation projects. He redistributed land to small farmers. Within a few years, grain production increased dramatically. Some regions even began producing surpluses. Another major focus was healthcare. Sankara launched one of the largest vaccination campaigns in African history. Millions of children were vaccinated against diseases such as measles and meningitis. In just a few years, child mortality dropped significantly. Education was also a priority. Schools were built in rural communities. Literacy campaigns encouraged adults to learn how to read and write. But perhaps the most revolutionary part of Sankara's leadership was his commitment to women's rights. At a time when many governments ignored gender equality, Sankara spoke openly about the issue. He said something powerful: "The revolution and women's liberation go together." He outlawed forced marriage. He fought against female genital mutilation. He encouraged women to work in professions that had traditionally been dominated by men. Women became government ministers. Women joined the military. Women participated in national development programs. These policies were bold, and they made Burkina Faso unique. But Sankara's ideas also made powerful enemies, not only inside the country, but outside it as well. As Sankara's reputation grew, he began speaking more boldly on the international stage. One of his most famous speeches was delivered in 1987. It happened during a meeting of the Organization of African Unity. In that speech, Sankara addressed a major issue affecting many developing nations: foreign debt. Many African countries had borrowed large amounts of money from international lenders. These debts became extremely difficult to repay. Interest payments alone consumed large parts of national budgets. Sankara believed this system trapped poor countries in a cycle of dependence. During his speech, he said something that shocked many world leaders. He argued that African nations should refuse to pay these debts. He described the debt system as a form of economic control. He warned that if Africa continued paying endlessly, the continent would remain poor forever. His speech was powerful, but it also made international financial institutions uncomfortable. Some governments feared his message might inspire other countries to follow the same path. At the same time, Sankara criticized the influence of former colonial powers in Africa, especially France. He argued that true independence required breaking old political and economic structures. This criticism placed him in direct opposition to powerful interests, and it created tension inside his own government, because not everyone agreed with his radical vision. Some officials believed his policies were moving too quickly. Others worried that Burkina Faso was becoming isolated from the international community. These tensions were quietly growing behind the scenes, and soon they would explode. On October 15, 1987, a tragic event changed the history of Burkina Faso forever. That afternoon, Thomas Sankara was meeting with several government officials in the capital city. Suddenly, armed soldiers surrounded the building. Gunfire erupted. Within minutes, Sankara was dead. He was only 37 years old. His body and the bodies of several loyal supporters were quickly buried. The coup was led by Sankara's close friend and political ally. His name was Blaise Compaoré, had been one of Sankara's most trusted colleagues. But something had changed. Exactly why the coup happened remains a subject of debate. Some historians believe political disagreements between the two leaders had become too severe. Others suspect that foreign interests may have supported the coup. For many citizens, the sudden death of Sankara felt like a betrayal. A leader who had promised dignity and independence was gone, and the revolution he started came to a sudden end. After the coup, Blaise Compaoré became the new leader of Burkina Faso. His rule would last for 27 years. One of his first decisions was to reverse many of Sankara's policies. Burkina Faso began rebuilding stronger relationships with Western governments, especially France. International investors returned, foreign aid increased, and the country began cooperating closely with Western security agencies. For many years, Compaoré was considered a reliable partner by Western governments. But inside Burkina Faso, opinions were mixed. Some people believed the country had become more stable. Others believed the revolutionary ideals of Sankara had been abandoned. Over time, accusations of corruption and political repression began to grow. Opposition leaders complained that elections were unfair. Journalists who criticized the government sometimes faced intimidation. But Compaoré remained in power for nearly 3 decades, until one dramatic moment changed everything again. In Arling-Isse, Blaise Compaoré attempted to change the constitution. The change would allow him to remain president even longer. Many citizens saw this as unacceptable. Protests erupted across the country. Thousands of people filled the streets. Government buildings were surrounded by demonstrators. Anger grew quickly. Within days, the situation became impossible to control. Finally, Compaoré resigned. After 27 years in power, he fled the country. For many citizens, this moment felt like a second revolution. The people had forced a long-time leader to step down, but the country was entering a new and uncertain chapter, and soon a dangerous new threat would emerge. Around the same time political change was happening in Burkina Faso, a major security crisis was developing in the region. The region is known as the Sahel. The Sahel stretches across several countries, including Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. In the early 2010s, extremist militant groups began expanding across the region. Some groups were linked to Al-Qaeda. Others claimed allegiance to Islamic State. These groups attacked military bases. They attacked villages. They kidnapped civilians. Governments struggled to respond. Large parts of rural territory became dangerous. Millions of people were displaced. Facing this growing crisis, regional governments asked for international help, and one country responded quickly. That country was France. France launched a large military mission called Operation Bark. Thousands of French soldiers were deployed across the Sahel region. Their mission was to hunt extremist groups and stabilize the area. At first, many governments welcomed this support. But over time, public opinion began to change, and the presence of foreign troops would eventually become one of the most controversial issues in the region. When France launched Operation Barkhane, many leaders in West Africa believed the mission would quickly weaken extremist groups. The mission began in 2014. Thousands of French soldiers were deployed across the Sahel. Their bases stretched across several countries, including Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. French fighter jets, helicopters, and special forces began targeting militant groups. At first, the operation seemed successful. Several militant leaders were killed, large weapons caches were destroyed, and major cities remained under government control. But there was a problem. The insurgency did not disappear. Instead, it began spreading. Militant groups changed their tactics. They avoided large battles. Instead, they launched surprise attacks on villages and military posts. They used motorcycles to move quickly through remote areas. They recruited young men from poor communities. And they used fear as a weapon. In many rural areas, government authority began collapsing. Schools closed. Hospitals shut down. Local officials fled. For ordinary villagers, life became extremely dangerous. Some communities faced threats from militant groups. Others were caught in military operations. Millions of people were forced to leave their homes. Across the Sahel, the number of displaced people increased dramatically. Many citizens began asking difficult questions. If thousands of foreign soldiers were present, why was the security situation getting worse? Why were attacks increasing instead of decreasing? And why were entire regions becoming ungovernable? These questions slowly began to change public opinion. As the conflict dragged on, frustration grew across the region. Many citizens began doubting the effectiveness of foreign military operations. Some believed that the international strategy was failing. Others began developing deeper suspicions. Rumors spread that foreign powers might have hidden interests in the region. The Sahel is rich in natural resources. Some areas contain gold deposits. Others contain important minerals. Although these rumors were often difficult to prove, they spread quickly on social media and in public discussions. In cities across West Africa, protests began appearing. Demonstrators carried signs criticizing foreign military presence. Some protesters accused France of protecting its own interests rather than solving the crises. In Mali, protests became particularly intense. Citizens demanded changes in the country's relationship with France, and similar sentiments began spreading into Burkina Faso. At the same time, extremist violence continued expanding. Attacks that once occurred mostly in remote border areas began reaching new regions. Markets were attacked, convoys were ambushed, even schools became targets. Parents became afraid to send their children to class. For many citizens, the government appeared unable to provide security, and this frustration began reaching the military. By the late 2010s, the security situation in Burkina Faso had become extremely serious. Thousands of civilians had been killed. Entire villages had been abandoned. Millions of people were internally displaced. The national army was struggling. Soldiers often lacked proper equipment. Some military units complained that they had insufficient support from the government. Morale began declining. Within the armed forces, frustration slowly turned into anger. Many officers believed political leaders were failing to address the crisis. At the same time, public confidence in the government continued falling. Citizens wanted stronger action. They wanted security. They wanted leadership that could protect the country. And eventually, this pressure reached a breaking point. In January 2022, soldiers in Burkina Faso took control of the government. The president at the time was Marc Christian Kabul. The military accused his administration of failing to stop extremist violence. Soon after the coup, a new leader emerged. His name was Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Damiba promised something that many citizens desperately wanted: security. He said the military would reorganize its strategy and defeat extremist groups. At first, some citizens supported the new leadership. They hoped the military government could succeed where politicians had failed. But months passed, and the security situation did not improve. Attacks continued. Villages continued to fall. Displaced families continued searching for safety. Within the army itself, frustration returned, and soon another dramatic change would occur. In September 2022, another coup took place inside Burkina Faso. This time, the leader of the uprising was a young army officer. His name was Ibrahim. At just 34 years old, Traoré became the leader of the country. He was one of the youngest heads of state in the world. Traoré explained that the previous military leadership had failed to restore security. He promised a new strategy, one focused on mobilizing the population and strengthening national sovereignty. Soon after taking power, Traoré began delivering speeches that attracted international attention. His message was clear. Burkina Faso must control its own destiny. The country must no longer depend entirely on foreign powers, and that included reconsidering its military partnerships. Among those partnerships, one stood out above all others: the long relationship with France. For decades, France had maintained military cooperation with several countries in the Sahel. French troops operated bases across the region. Their goal was to fight extremist groups. But under Traoré's leadership, this relationship came under intense scrutiny. Supporters of change argued that the existing strategy had failed. They believed Burkina Faso needed a new approach. Critics worried that removing foreign support might weaken the fight against militants. The debate became emotional. Many citizens remembered the long history between Burkina Faso and France. A history that began during colonial rule, a history that included political alliances, economic influence, and military cooperation. But now, younger generations were asking new questions. Was the relationship still beneficial, or had it become an obstacle to true independence? These debates were happening not only in Burkina Faso, they were happening across much of Africa, and they were shaping a new political landscape. In early 2023, the government of Burkina Faso made a dramatic announcement. The country would end its military agreement with France. French forces were given a deadline to withdraw. The decision sent shockwaves through international politics. For decades, France had been one of the most influential foreign powers in West Africa. Now, one of its former colonies was rejecting its military presence. Within weeks, French soldiers began preparing to leave. Equipment was loaded onto trucks. Aircraft transported personnel and supplies. The withdrawal marked the end of an era. For many citizens, it was a moment of pride. For others, it created uncertainty, because one important question remained. What would happen next? After the departure of French forces, Burkina Faso began exploring new partnerships. The country strengthened relationships with neighboring Mali and Niger, which were also rethinking their relationships with Western powers. At the same time, global powers began paying closer attention to the region. Countries such as Russia and China showed increasing interest in Africa's political future. Analysts began describing the Sahel as a new arena of geopolitical competition. But for the people living there, the issue was not global strategy. It was survival, security, and the hope for a stable future. Even decades after his death, the ideas of Thomas Sankara still influence political discussions in Burkina Faso. Many young people see him as a symbol of dignity and independence. His speeches continue to circulate online. His image appears on posters during demonstrations. For some citizens, the decision to expel foreign troops felt like a continuation of Sankara's vision. A vision where African countries control their own resources, their own policies, and their own futures. But history is rarely simple. The challenges facing Burkina Faso remain enormous. Extremist violence still threatens communities. Economic hardship affects millions, and the country must navigate complex international relationships. The path forward will not be easy, but the story of Burkina Faso is still unfolding. When Burkina Faso announced that French troops must leave the country, the reaction was immediate. Governments around the world began discussing the decision. For France, the announcement was a major political moment. For decades, France had maintained strong military influence across West Africa. French bases had existed in several countries. French military operations had become a central part of the fight against extremist groups in the Sahel. But now that influence was shrinking. First, Mali had demanded that French forces leave. Then Burkina Faso made the same decision. Observers began asking an important question. Was this the beginning of a larger shift in Africa? Many analysts believed the answer was yes. Across the continent, a new generation of citizens was questioning old political relationships. Young Africans were discussing colonial history more openly. They were asking whether the structures created during colonial rule still shaped modern politics. They were asking whether true independence had ever been fully achieved. These debates were especially intense online. Social media platforms became spaces where young Africans shared historical documents, speeches, and videos. One figure appeared frequently in these discussions. The revolutionary leader, Thomas Sankara. His speeches about economic independence and dignity seemed more relevant than ever, and many young people began connecting his ideas to the current political moment. To understand why the decision to expel French troops carried so much emotional weight, it is necessary to look again at history. When France controlled Upper Volta, the territory was part of a much larger colonial system. This system connected several West African territories into one administrative network called French West Africa. The system was designed primarily to serve the economic interests of the colonial power. Railways transported raw materials from the interior to coastal ports. Agricultural products were exported to European markets. Local economies were often reshaped to support this system. Even after independence in 1960, many economic structures remained similar. Trade patterns continued. Financial systems stayed linked. Military cooperation agreements were maintained. Some critics describe this system as a continuation of colonial influence under a different name. Others argued that the relationships were simply partnerships between sovereign nations. But the debate never completely disappeared. And when modern security crises developed in the Sahel, those historical memories returned to the surface. For many citizens, the presence of foreign troops reminded them of earlier periods when external powers controlled African territory. Whether those comparisons were accurate or not, they shaped public opinion. History was influencing modern politics. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré represented something new in African politics. He was extremely young compared to most world leaders. Born in 1988, he belonged to a generation that grew up long after the formal end of colonial rule. For many of his supporters, this mattered. They believed younger leaders might approach international relationships differently. Instead of continuing long-standing alliances automatically, they might reconsider them. Traoré often speaks about sovereignty. In his speeches, he emphasizes that Burkina Faso must make decisions based on its own interests. He has also encouraged citizens to support national defense efforts. Volunteer defense forces have been organized in several regions. Communities are being asked to play a role in protecting their territory. This strategy is controversial. Some analysts believe community defense forces can help strengthen local resistance to militant groups. Others worry that poorly trained militias could create new problems. But one thing is clear. Burkina Faso is attempting a new approach. The government believes that national mobilization and independence from foreign military influence could produce different results. Whether this strategy will succeed remains uncertain. The Sahel remains one of the most complex regions in the world today. It stretches thousands of kilometers across Africa. The region faces enormous challenges. Climate change has made droughts more severe. Economic opportunities remain limited in many rural areas. Population growth is rapid, and extremist groups continue to operate in remote regions. Solving these problems will require long-term strategies. Security alone will not be enough. Many experts believe that development, education, and economic investment must also play major roles. Without these, instability may continue. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape of Africa is changing. New global partnerships are emerging. Countries such as China, Russia, Turkey, and India are expanding their presence across the continent. African governments now have more options for international cooperation than they did in the past. This could reshape political alliances in the coming decades. For Burkina Faso, the future will depend on many factors. Security must improve, economic opportunities must grow, and political stability must be maintained. These goals are difficult, but they are not impossible. The story of Burkina Faso is not only about one political decision. It is about a long historical journey, a journey that began during the colonial era, a journey shaped by revolution, tragedy, and resistance. From the revolutionary vision of Thomas Sankara to the decades of rule under Blaise, to the modern leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, each chapter has shaped the country's identity. Expelling French troops was not simply a diplomatic decision. For many citizens, it symbolized something deeper, a desire for control, a desire for dignity, a desire to shape their own future. But history rarely moves in straight lines. The challenges facing Burkina Faso remain serious. Security threats still exist. Economic struggles continue, and the region's future remains uncertain. Yet one thing is clear. The people of Burkina Faso have shown that they are willing to question long-standing systems. They are willing to challenge powerful relationships, and they are willing to search for a path that reflects their own vision of independence. Whether that path will succeed is a question that only time can answer. But the story is far from over. Because the future of Burkina Faso and the future of the is still being written.